In a small, quiet village nestled in the shadow of rolling hills, there lived an old woman named Asha. Her name meant hope, and it was said that she carried more of it than anyone else in the village. Her life was simple, even by the modest standards of the villagers, yet she radiated a contentment that baffled everyone. No matter the season, no matter the hardship, Asha's face seemed to glow with a quiet joy. The villagers often whispered about her. How could someone who had seen so much suffering be so at peace? Her little house stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that seemed to bloom with a kind of vitality most could only dream of. Herbs, flowers, and even vegetables thrived there, as though they, too, were lifted by her presence. Her days were spent tending to the garden, walking to the market, or simply sitting on her porch, knitting scarves for children in the village. But Asha's peaceful demeanor wasn't always met with admiration. Some called her naive, others questioned if her apparent happiness was a mask for sorrow too deep to show. There was a story everyone knew about her, though few dared to speak of it. Decades ago, Asha had been a mother and a wife. Her life had been full of laughter, shared meals, and the warmth of a family. But one winter night, a fire had torn through her home, claiming the lives of her husband and her 2 children. A tragedy like that could break a person beyond repair, and for a time, it seemed as though it had. Asha disappeared for months, retreating into the hills, and when she returned, she was changed. But not in the way people expected. There was no bitterness in her, no despair. Instead, she returned with a deep calmness, a resilience that made her seem otherworldly. The villagers had never stopped wondering what had happened to her during those months. Some believed she had found divine guidance. Others thought she had simply gone mad. Asha, for her part, never offered an explanation. When asked, she would smile and say, "Happiness isn't something you find. It's something you carry with you, no matter where you are." One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a young woman named Mira approached Asha's house. Mira was a newcomer to the village, having moved there just months before with her husband. Unlike Asha, Mira carried the weight of her struggles on her face, lines of worry etched into her brow, her shoulders perpetually slumped as though the world rested on them. She had heard about the old woman who seemed immune to sorrow, and though she didn't fully believe the stories, desperation had driven her to seek her out. Asha was sitting on her porch, her knitting needles clicking softly, when she saw Mira hesitating at the gate. She looked up, her warm smile inviting. "Come in, child," she said, setting her knitting aside. "You look like you have something on your mind." Mira stepped cautiously into the garden, her eyes darting to the flowers and herbs that seemed to radiate life. She wrung her hands nervously as she approached the porch. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began, her voice faltering. I've been struggling, and people say that you know how to be happy. I don't even know if I believe that's possible, but..." Asha stood and gestured for Mira to sit beside her. "You don't need to apologize," she said gently. "Happiness is not a thing you chase after. But sit. Tell me what's troubling you." Mira hesitated, then sat down, her eyes filling with tears before she even began to speak. She told Asha about her struggles, about the sleepless nights worrying about her husband's failing business, the pressure to be the perfect wife in a new village, the gnawing fear that her life would never be more than a series of hardships. She spoke in halting sentences, the weight of her words spilling out as though they had been trapped inside her for too long. Asha listened without interruption, her expression soft but unreadable. When Mira finally fell silent, the old woman reached out and took her hand. "You are carrying so much," Asha said quietly. "Too much. It's no wonder you feel like you're drowning." Mira looked down at her lap, her voice barely a whisper. "I just want to be happy. But it feels impossible." Asha leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the horizon where the last light of day was fading. "Happiness," she said, "is not the absence of hardship. It is the presence of grace. And grace, my dear, is something you can choose." Mira frowned. "What do you mean?" Asha smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "When my home burned down," she said softly, "I thought my life was over. I thought there was no way to go on, no reason to even try. 4 months, I carried that pain like a boulder on my back. It was all I could see, all I could feel. But one day, as I sat on a hill overlooking this village, I realized something. The pain wasn't the problem. It was my refusal to let it be what it was. I was fighting it, trying to push it away, and in doing so I was fighting myself." Mira listened intently, her brow furrowed. "So you just accepted it?" "Not just accepted it," Asha said. "I embraced it. I let myself feel the weight of it, the sharpness, the depth. And then I let it teach me. Pain, you see, is a great teacher if you're willing to listen." Mira shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But how does that make you happy? How can you find joy in something so terrible?" Asha reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. She held it out to Mira. "Feel this," she said. Mira took the stone, running her fingers over its surface. It was cool and smooth, polished to perfection. "What is it?" "It's a river stone," Asha said. "Do you know how it became so smooth? The water didn't avoid it. It didn't flow around it or ignore it. The water embraced the stone, rushing over it, wearing it down little by little. It shaped it, softened its edges, made it beautiful. Our hardships are like that, Mira. They shape us, smooth us if we let them. But only if we let them." Mira stared at the stone, her mind racing. She wanted to believe Asha's words, to trust that happiness was within reach. But doubt clung to her like a shadow. "What if I can't?" she whispered. "What if it's too hard?" Asha placed a hand on Mira's shoulder, her grip firm yet comforting. "You don't have to have all the answers now," she said. "Start small. When you feel overwhelmed, take a breath and remind yourself that this moment is just a moment. It will pass. And when it does, you'll still be here, stronger for having faced it." Mira nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. Asha smiled, sensing her hesitation. "Stay for a while," she said. "Let's have some tea. You'll see. Happiness isn't something distant. It's here in the small things." As they sat together on the porch, the night deepened, stars appearing one by one in the darkened sky. The soft murmur of the village faded into the background, leaving only the gentle rustle of leaves and the warmth of shared silence. Mira felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, not quite happiness, but the possibility of it. And for now that was enough. Mira stayed on the porch with Asha long after the village had gone quiet, their tea growing cold in the cups they cradled. The night air was crisp, but there was a strange comfort in its chill. For the first time in what felt like years, Mira didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. Asha sat beside her, perfectly at ease, as though the simple act of sharing this moment was enough. As the stars grew brighter, Mira's thoughts wandered back to the stories she'd heard about Asha. The villagers spoke of her almost like a legend, someone who had suffered unimaginable loss and yet carried herself as though her heart had never known pain. It was hard to reconcile the kind, unassuming woman beside her with the tragic figure Mira had imagined. She wanted to know more, to understand how someone could endure so much and still find the strength to smile. But the words felt heavy in her throat, and she hesitated to ask. Asha seemed to sense her unease. She set her cup down and turned to Mira with a gentle smile. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" she asked softly. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Mira nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I have," she admitted, "but I didn't come here to pry. I wanted to understand how you do it. How you find happiness when everything feels so hard." Asha leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the garden bathed in moonlight. For a moment, she didn't say anything, as though she were carefully choosing her words. "It's not about finding happiness," she said finally. It's about creating it, even in the smallest of ways. Mira frowned, her fingers tightening around her cup. But how do you create happiness when everything around you feels broken? When nothing seems to go the way you want? Asha chuckled softly, a sound that was more understanding than amused. You're asking the right questions, she said. The answer, though, isn't something I can simply give you. It's something you have to discover for yourself. But I can tell you this. Happiness isn't about perfection. It's not about everything going right. It's about learning to see the beauty in what's left. The words hung in the air between them, and Mira let them sink in. She wanted to believe them, but her mind was filled with doubts and what-ifs. Asha's life seemed so distant from her own struggles, so unreachable. How could she possibly apply such wisdom to her own messy, chaotic world? As if reading her thoughts, Asha stood and gestured for Mira to follow her. Come with me, she said. I want to show you something. Mira hesitated but eventually rose from her seat, curiosity outweighing her apprehension. She followed Asha through the garden, the soft crunch of gravel under their feet the only sound. They stopped near a cluster of flowers, their petals glowing faintly in the moonlight. These are night-blooming jasmine, Asha said, crouching to touch one of the delicate flowers. They only open after the sun has set. During the day, they stay closed, hidden from view. But at night, when the world is dark and quiet, they bloom. Their fragrance is strongest when everything else is still. Mira knelt beside her, staring at the flowers. Their beauty was undeniable, but it was the timing of their bloom that struck her. They only bloom in the dark, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Asha nodded. They remind me that even in the darkest moments, there's something waiting to bloom. Something waiting to show its beauty, even when it seems like the world has forgotten it. Mira touched one of the flowers gently, her mind racing. She thought about the nights she had spent lying awake, consumed by worry and doubt. She had always seen those moments as empty, as wasted time. But what if they weren't? What if, like the jasmine, something within her was waiting for the right moment to bloom? As they walked back to the porch, Asha began to speak again, her voice low and steady. She told Mira about the months she had spent in the hills after the fire, how she had felt lost and broken, as though her very soul had been scorched. At first, she had resisted the pain, trying to numb it with distractions and busyness. But the more she fought it, the heavier it became. One day, while sitting by a stream, she had a realization. The water flowed around the rocks, not because it ignored them, but because it embraced them. It didn't try to move the rocks out of its way. It simply found a path through them. In that moment, she decided to stop fighting her pain and instead let it flow through her. She began to see her grief not as an obstacle, but as a part of her story, something that had shaped her but didn't have to define her. Mira listened intently, her heart aching at the raw honesty in Asha's words. She could see the wisdom in them, but they also left her with more questions. Could she really embrace her own pain? Could she let go of the need to control every aspect of her life and trust that happiness would find its way to her? As the night deepened, Mira finally found the courage to speak. Do you ever feel it again? She asked hesitantly. The sadness, the pain? Asha smiled, a bittersweet expression that spoke volumes. Of course I do, she said. Grief doesn't disappear. It becomes a part of you, like an old friend who visits from time to time. But it doesn't have to consume you. You can feel it, acknowledge it, and still choose joy. Mira nodded slowly, her mind swirling with thoughts. She wasn't sure if she could ever reach the level of peace Asha seemed to have found, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to carry her struggles without letting them define her. As she prepared to leave, Asha placed a small pouch in her hand. Inside are some jasmine seeds, she said. Plant them in your garden. Care for them, watch them grow. They'll remind you that beauty can bloom even in the darkest of times. Mira clutched the pouch tightly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Asha simply smiled and nodded, watching as Mira disappeared into the night. The old woman turned back toward her house, her own heart lightened by the exchange. She had seen the same doubts and fears in Mira that she had once carried herself, and she knew the journey ahead would not be easy. But she also knew that the seeds of happiness had been planted, both in Mira's hands and in her heart. All that remained was for them to bloom in their own time. In the days that followed, Mira couldn't shake the conversation with Asha from her mind. The jasmine seeds Asha had given her sat on the windowsill, a silent promise of growth, yet Mira found herself struggling with doubt. She had planted them in her garden, just as Asha had suggested, but the soil felt hard beneath her fingers, and the seeds felt too small for the weight of her expectations. Could something so fragile really grow into something beautiful? Could she truly embrace happiness, even when the world around her seemed to be falling apart? Her husband, Rajesh, had become increasingly withdrawn. His business struggles were mounting, and Mira could see the toll it was taking on him. He had always been a man of quiet resolve, but now he seemed more distant than ever. He barely spoke about the mounting debt, the stress that had kept him awake for countless nights. Instead, he buried himself in long hours at the office, leaving Mira to manage the house and worry about the future alone. One evening, as Mira sat in the dimly lit kitchen, stirring a pot of lentils, she heard the faint creak of the front door. Rajesh had come home late again. He walked into the kitchen, his steps slow, his eyes tired, but there was something else, a certain heaviness in the air. Mira looked up, her heart sinking. "Rajesh, you're back late again," she said, trying to keep her tone light, though she couldn't help the concern creeping into her voice. "How was the meeting?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat at the table and rested his elbows on his knees, his fingers pressed against his forehead. Mira waited, the silence between them growing thick with unspoken words. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Rajesh said finally, his voice low and strained. "I've tried everything, Mira. Every option, every possible solution, and nothing's working. The bank is on my back, and I—" He broke off, his words lost in a deep sigh. Mira's stomach twisted, the familiar ache of helplessness rising within her. She had known things weren't going well, but hearing him say it aloud made it feel so much more real. The weight of his despair seemed to settle in her chest, making it harder to breathe. "I don't know what to do anymore," Rajesh muttered, running his hands through his hair. "I've failed you." Mira's heart shattered at the vulnerability in his voice. She knew how much he valued his ability to provide, to fix things, to protect her. But this was beyond him, beyond both of them. She had watched the light fade from his eyes over the past few months, and now she could see the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. But what could she do? She had been trying so hard to hold everything together, to find peace within herself, but her own fears and uncertainties were eating away at her. The seeds of happiness Asha had given her seemed so insignificant now, so small against the overwhelming tide of stress and worry that consumed her life. The next morning, Mira found herself walking again to Asha's house. The road felt longer this time, as though the weight of her own doubts had made the journey harder to bear. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the village as she approached the familiar gate. When Asha greeted her at the door, there was no judgment in her eyes, just a quiet understanding. "You've come again," Asha said gently, as though she had known all along that Mira would return. "What troubles you now, child?" Mira felt the lump in her throat and, for the first time, allowed herself to break down. "I don't know how to do it, Asha," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to stay strong for Rajesh when I can barely keep it together for myself. I've tried to be like you, to find peace, to hold on to hope, but everything is falling apart. I feel like I'm drowning." Asha guided her to the porch and sat her down, offering her a warm cup of tea. The fragrance of jasmine filled the air, a quiet reminder of the lesson Asha had shared. "The world will try to pull you under, Mira," Asha said, her voice soft but firm. It will offer you many reasons to give up, to let go of hope. But it's in those moments, when everything feels impossible, that you must choose to rise. Not for anyone else, but for yourself. Mira looked at Asha, the older woman's face calm and serene, despite the struggles of her own past. "But how?" she whispered. "How do I rise when I feel like I'm already broken?" Asha took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "You're not broken, child," she said. "You are simply weary, and that weariness is part of your journey. You have to give yourself permission to rest, to pause, to breathe. And then, from that place of stillness, you will find your way forward." Mira sat silently, taking in Asha's words, though part of her still clung to the fear that she wasn't strong enough. Could she really take that first step toward healing? Could she really find happiness again when everything around her seemed so uncertain? As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Asha began to speak again. "I know you're struggling, Mira. I know your heart aches for Rajesh. But remember, you cannot carry his burdens for him. You cannot fix what is beyond your control. You can only choose to bring light into the darkness you both face." Mira nodded, her fingers wrapped tightly around her cup as though it were the only thing keeping her anchored. "I don't know how to stop worrying," she admitted. "I don't know how to stop being afraid." Asha's gaze softened. "Fear is a natural part of life, child. But don't let it rule you. Don't let it keep you from the life that's waiting for you, just beyond your pain." The silence that followed felt heavy, but not in a way that stifled Mira's breath. Instead, it gave her space to think, to reflect on the choices she had been avoiding. She had spent so much time trying to control everything around her, trying to hold on to the illusion of perfection, that she had forgotten the most important thing: to live in the present, to embrace the imperfection of life and find joy in the small moments. As she stood to leave, Asha placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch warm and steady. "Remember the flowers," she said. "Even when the world feels dark, there is beauty waiting to bloom. You only need to be patient." Mira left Asha's house that afternoon with a heart full of questions. But this time, there was a flicker of something inside her, a spark of hope that had been reignited. It wasn't a guarantee, nor was it an easy fix. But she knew that she had the power to choose. She had the power to find beauty, even in the darkest moments. The real question was, would she have the courage to begin? Mira returned home that evening with a sense of quiet determination, but the weight of the world still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at the jasmine seeds on her windowsill, now a reminder of Asha's wisdom, but doubt lingered in her mind like a shadow. How could something so small possibly change the way she viewed her life? How could a few words of encouragement lift her from the depths of her own fears? Rajesh was already home, sitting at the kitchen table, his face obscured by the papers and bills scattered in front of him. The dim light from the overhead lamp cast a cold glow on his hunched shoulders. Mira's heart tightened. She had hoped that some of Asha's words would help her find clarity, but the man sitting in front of her seemed more distant than ever. She set the tea down beside him, watching him glance up at her with a hollow expression. He didn't smile. He didn't ask about her day. The silence between them grew thick, and Mira felt the familiar tension building. "Rajesh, we need to talk," she said, her voice breaking the quiet like a crack of thunder. He looked at her, his eyes tired, but there was something else beneath the surface, something she couldn't name. "I know," he muttered. "I know we need to talk. But there's nothing to say, Mira. It's all slipping through our fingers." Her heart pounded in her chest. She had heard him say similar words before, but this time, they were different. The despair in his voice wasn't just about the business. It felt deeper, darker, like he was losing hope in everything they had built together. His words sent a chill through her, and for the first time, she feared the unspoken truth. He was giving up. "Don't say that," Mira whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't give up." But Rajesh didn't respond. He simply buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It was as if the weight of his failures had crushed him, and he couldn't find the strength to rise again. Mira's mind raced. Asha's words echoed in her ears. You cannot carry his burdens for him. You can only choose to bring light into the darkness you both face. But how could she bring light to a man who had already shut himself off from everything around him? How could she embrace happiness when the man she loved was lost in his own despair? The next few days felt like a blur. Mira found herself caught between her own struggle to find peace and the suffocating weight of Rajesh's unraveling. She tried to offer comfort, but her words seemed to fall flat. Every time she reached out to him, he pulled further away. The house, once full of warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty. Mira walked through the rooms, each one filled with memories of happier times, but they only served to remind her of what they were losing. Then came the day when the bank sent the final notice. Rajesh had ignored their warnings, convinced there was still time to fix everything, but now the deadline had passed. The weight of the letter in his hand seemed to drag him deeper into despair. Mira watched as he stared at the notice, his face pale, his hands trembling. This was it, the point of no return. Rajesh, Mira began, her voice shaking with fear. She had never seen him like this, not even when they first started their journey together, struggling to build a life from nothing. He had always been the one who kept them steady. But now he seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. He looked up at her, his face drawn and exhausted. What do you want me to say, Mira? He asked, his voice empty. I've tried everything. I can't fix this. I can't fix us. The words hit her like a blow. She had known this was coming, had seen the cracks forming over the past few months, but hearing him admit it out loud felt like a final blow. He was ready to let go. But Mira wasn't. She couldn't give up. Not yet. Please, she pleaded, her voice raw with emotion. We can figure this out together. We've been through worse before. We can't just let go. Rajesh's eyes seemed distant, as though he wasn't really seeing her, as though he had already given up on the life they had built. He stood up abruptly, walking away from her without another word. Mira felt her heart shatter as she watched him retreat into the other room, closing the door between them. The distance between them felt like an insurmountable wall. She sank onto the couch, her body heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. The jasmine seeds on the windowsill caught her eye, and for a moment she considered them, those tiny seeds of hope Asha had given her. But could they really grow into something beautiful? Could she find a way to bloom in the midst of this darkness? The hours passed, and the silence in the house grew deafening. Mira felt her thoughts spiraling into a dark place. She had been trying so hard to hold on, to find a way to embrace the light Asha had spoken of, but the more she tried, the more everything seemed to slip further away. Rajesh was lost to her, and the life they had dreamed of seemed like a distant memory. But then, just as she was about to give in to despair, there was a knock at the door. Startled, Mira wiped the tears from her eyes and stood up, her heart racing. Who could it be? She opened the door slowly, her breath catching in her throat when she saw who stood there. Asha, as calm and composed as ever, stood on the doorstep. The familiar scent of jasmine seemed to fill the air, and for the first time in days, Mira felt a glimmer of hope. But Asha's expression was serious, more intense than Mira had ever seen before. I've been watching you, Asha said quietly, her eyes searching Mira's face. You're on the edge, aren't you? You're at the breaking point. Mira nodded, the tears threatening to spill once more. I don't know what to do anymore, Asha. I've tried everything, but nothing is working. Rajesh is slipping away from me, and I can't save him. Asha stepped forward, her presence filling the doorway with warmth. You're not meant to save him, Mira, she said gently. But you are meant to save yourself. You can't let his darkness drown your light. Mira stared at Asha, her mind reeling. Could she really find her way out of this despair? Could she truly embrace happiness, even in the face of everything that was falling apart? The tension between them felt unbearable, as if the answer was just beyond reach, waiting to be discovered. Asha's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on Mira's shoulder. "You are stronger than you think," she said. "But you have to believe it. You have to choose to rise." Mira stood in the doorway, her mind spinning, trying to process Asha's words. She had heard them before, the idea of choosing to rise, of finding strength within, but it never seemed that simple. The weight of Rajesh's despair, the closing door between them, all of it had already pulled her down so far. How could she rise above it all now? Asha's calmness was unsettling in its certainty. It almost felt like she knew something Mira didn't, a secret, perhaps, a way forward that wasn't immediately clear. As Mira opened her mouth to respond, a sudden noise came from inside the house, a crash, followed by a sharp cry. Mira's heart lurched in her chest, her thoughts racing. It was Rajesh's voice, filled with a panic she hadn't heard before. She rushed inside, Asha right behind her, and found Rajesh standing in the kitchen, staring at the broken plate on the floor. His face was pale, his hands trembling, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. "What happened?" Mira asked, her voice laced with concern, her own anxiety bubbling up. Rajesh didn't respond at first. His eyes were wide, and he seemed to be looking past her, at something, someone she couldn't see. His gaze flicked from one corner of the room to another, as though he was trying to make sense of something that wasn't there. "Rajesh," Mira repeated, stepping closer. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, Rajesh finally spoke, but his voice was strained, as though he were forcing the words out. I saw someone in the corner of the room. Standing there." Mira's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about? There's no one here." "I know what I saw," Rajesh snapped, his eyes wild now. "I swear, Mira, there was someone there. A figure. And it looked like me." A cold chill swept through the room, and Mira felt her skin prickle with unease. This wasn't like Rajesh. He had always been grounded in reality, someone who could be relied upon in moments of crisis. But now, it was as though the very fabric of his mind was unraveling. He wasn't just lost in despair. He was seeing things, believing in things that weren't real. Or were they? Asha stepped forward, her presence steady and calm in the chaos of the moment. She placed a gentle hand on Rajesh's shoulder, but he flinched away from her touch, his eyes wide with panic. "You need to listen to me, Rajesh," Asha said quietly, her voice firm but compassionate. "There's more to this than just the surface. You can't keep fighting what's inside of you." Rajesh's lips trembled, and he shook his head. "I don't understand. I'm losing control. Everything is slipping away from me. I don't know how to hold on anymore." Mira's heart broke for him. She had always known he was struggling, but this was different. It wasn't just the financial pressure or the strain of everyday life. Something deeper, more elusive, was gnawing at him, taking hold of his mind in ways she couldn't comprehend. Asha's eyes never left Rajesh's face as she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "The darkness inside you doesn't just go away because you ignore it. It will follow you, shadow you, until you face it. Until you understand it." Rajesh's breathing grew shallow, his eyes darting around the room, as though the walls were closing in on him. "What does that mean? What am I supposed to do?" Asha's gaze softened, and she gave Mira a brief, knowing glance before turning back to Rajesh. "You need to look at what's behind your fear. What is it that you're truly afraid of, Rajesh?" The question hung in the air like a heavy fog. Mira felt it too, the weight of his fear, the uncertainty that had seeped into every corner of their lives. But what was it that he was truly afraid of? Was it the fear of failure? The fear of losing everything they had worked for? Or was it something deeper, something from his past that had finally caught up with him? Mira felt a pang of recognition. She remembered how Rajesh had been when they first met. So full of life, so determined to create a future, to build something beautiful. But somewhere along the way, the joy had faded. The laughter had diminished. And now, it seemed like he was on the edge of breaking completely. But why? Asha's voice cut through Mira's thoughts. You must confront the root of this fear, Rajesh. Only then can you be free of it. Suddenly, everything felt too overwhelming. Mira's mind raced as she tried to understand. Was this the key to fixing everything? Was confronting the fear the way forward? But how could she help Rajesh do that when he wasn't even willing to acknowledge the depth of his pain? Rajesh's expression changed then, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to focus on something that wasn't immediately visible. I remember something, he whispered, almost to himself. A long time ago. There was a night. A time when I failed. A time when I lost everything. Mira felt a jolt of shock. She had never heard Rajesh talk about his past in this way, as though it were something that haunted him. His voice was distant, like he was speaking from another world. What do you mean, Rajesh? Mira asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. But before he could answer, the room seemed to shift, as if the very atmosphere around them had changed. A cold draft swept through the kitchen, even though the windows were shut. Rajesh's face grew paler, his eyes locked on something behind Mira. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. She swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Rajesh's voice broke the silence, quiet but urgent. Mira, listen to me. This isn't just about the bills. It's not just about the business. It's something else. Something I've been running from for years. Asha stepped forward, her eyes piercing Rajesh's soul. It's time to face it, Rajesh. You can no longer keep running. The past is here, and it's waiting for you. Mira felt a chill run down her spine. What was Rajesh hiding? What was it that had tormented him for so long? Something so powerful that it had driven him to the brink of madness. The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension was unbearable. It was clear that something much bigger was at play, something that neither she nor Rajesh had fully understood until now. But what? Before Mira could voice her thoughts, Rajesh's eyes widened in horror. No, not now, he whispered, backing away from Asha and Mira as if he had seen something behind them. His voice shook with terror. I can't face it. Not again. Please. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself was suffocating them. What was Rajesh about to reveal? What was he so afraid of, and how would it change everything for them? The answers were just beyond reach, and Mira could only stand there, frozen, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Rajesh's eyes were wide with terror, his breath coming in rapid bursts as he backed further into the corner of the kitchen. Mira felt her heart race, her pulse quickening in response to the palpable fear that radiated from him. Asha stood motionless, her expression unreadable but intense, as if she knew something no one else did. Mira opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, Rajesh's voice cut through the silence, hoarse and broken. It's her, he whispered. She's back. Mira's heart skipped a beat. Who's back, Rajesh? Her voice cracked, panic threading through her words. She looked around frantically, as though expecting to see something, or someone that Rajesh was seeing. She's the one who destroyed everything, Rajesh continued, his voice trembling. The one who made me believe that I wasn't good enough, that I'd never succeed. The one who planted the seeds of doubt in my mind, made me doubt everything, everyone, even you. Mira's mind raced. Who was he talking about? The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, but she had no idea where this was going, or how to make sense of it. She glanced at Asha, who gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as though urging her to listen. Tell me more, Mira said gently, taking a step closer to Rajesh, hoping to ground him in the present, hoping to help him find his way back from whatever this was. Rajesh's eyes never left the empty space behind Mira. It was years ago, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was young, full of hope. I had dreams, Mira. But there was someone in my life, a woman who took all of that away. She was manipulative, cruel. She convinced me that I wasn't capable of achieving anything on my own, that I was weak, that I would always fail. And I believed her. I spent years trying to prove her wrong, but the damage she did, it stayed with me. A shiver ran down Mira's spine as the pieces started to fall into place. Rajesh's struggles, his insecurities, they weren't just born of external pressures. They had deeper roots, a dark history that he had never shared with her. The woman he spoke of had been a shadow over his life for years, perhaps longer than Mira had known. She destroyed everything, Mira, Rajesh said, his voice cracking as his eyes filled with anguish. My family, my future, my happiness. And now, his voice faltered, as if he couldn't bring himself to finish the thought. Asha stepped forward, her calm presence steadying the air around them. Rajesh, she said softly but firmly, the woman you're afraid of isn't just someone from your past. She's a part of your mind, a manifestation of your doubts and fears. She's not real, Rajesh. You've carried her with you for far too long. It's time to let go. Mira looked from Asha to Rajesh, trying to understand. Asha was right, in a way. This woman, this figure that Rajesh feared, was a symbol of everything he had allowed to hold him back. The beliefs, the self-doubt, the guilt. Rajesh had let this fear take root in his mind, and now it was taking control of him. But how could he let go of something so deeply ingrained in his soul? How could he cast out this part of his past that had become such a core part of who he was? Rajesh, Asha said, her voice gentle yet commanding. This is your moment. The only way to truly be free is to stop running. You need to look at her, not with fear, but with understanding. Acknowledge what she represents, and then release it. Only then will you be free. Mira watched as Rajesh's expression flickered, his eyes shifted, his breath slowed. There was a moment of silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, slowly, Rajesh nodded. The fear in his eyes began to dissipate, replaced by something deeper, something raw. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and yet Mira could sense that the journey was far from over. He took a deep breath, and in a voice that was quieter but filled with resolve, he said, I see it now. I see her for what she truly is. Just a reflection of everything I've been holding on to. The pain, the fear, the self-doubt. It's all just been a shadow in my mind. And I've been feeding it for so long. Mira's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and hope. This was the turning point. Rajesh had finally confronted the source of his pain, the root of his struggle. But Asha's words echoed in her mind. It wasn't enough to just confront it. He had to let it go. Rajesh took a deep, steadying breath and closed his eyes. For a moment, everything was quiet. The tension in the room seemed to evaporate as Rajesh exhaled, releasing the fear that had gripped him for so long. When he opened his eyes again, there was a clarity in them that hadn't been there before. He looked at Mira, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the man she had fallen in love with. The one who was capable of hope, of love, of dreams. The man who could be happy, even in the darkest of times. I'm free, he whispered, as if the words were a revelation. I'm free from her. From all of it. Mira felt tears well up in her eyes, a mix of joy and relief flooding her heart. They had made it through. They had faced the darkness together, and now they could move forward, side by side. The journey wasn't over, but it was beginning anew. But just as the weight of the moment began to settle, something unexpected happened. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Mira's heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her throat. It was the woman, the one from Rajesh's past, the one he had just let go of. She stood in the doorway, her eyes cold and unforgiving. Did you really think you could escape me? Her voice was sharp, cruel. Did you think you could be free? Rajesh's face went pale once again, his breath faltering as he took a step back. But this time it was different. This time, he didn't look at her with fear. He didn't tremble or shrink away. Instead, he met her gaze with steady resolve. "No," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. You're just a part of my past. And you don't control me." The figure in the doorway seemed to falter, her expression flickering with something like uncertainty. And then, with a final, scornful laugh, she disappeared into the air, leaving nothing behind but an echo of her presence. Rajesh turned to Meera, his eyes filled with quiet strength. "It's over," he said simply. And for the first time in years, Meera believed him. The storm had passed. They were free. The room was silent now, the air heavy with the weight of the moment. Rajesh stood tall, his shoulders no longer hunched under the weight of unseen burdens. Meera could see it in his eyes, the clarity, the peace that had been absent for so long. He wasn't just free from the past. He had liberated himself from the chains of self-doubt and fear that had kept him trapped for years. Meera reached out and gently took his hand, her touch soft but steady. There were no words needed between them. In that single gesture, they both understood. They had come through the storm together, and now it was time to rebuild. As they stood there, the weight of their shared journey settled around them. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when Meera wondered if they would ever make it through. Rajesh's pain had been so deep, so entrenched in his psyche, that it had seemed impossible for him to overcome. But now, as they stood together in the quiet aftermath, Meera realized something that she had only vaguely understood before. True happiness wasn't about escaping pain. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and letting it go. She had watched Rajesh grow, watched him confront the ghosts of his past and finally free himself from their grip. But she knew that his journey wasn't just about letting go of a painful memory. It was about finding strength in the present, in the love they shared, in the life they were building together. And now he was free. They both were. "I'm so proud of you," Meera whispered, her voice filled with love and admiration. Rajesh smiled at her, a quiet, genuine smile that spoke volumes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Meera. You were the one who reminded me that happiness isn't something we wait for. It's something we create, right here, in the moment." As the days passed, Meera and Rajesh worked together to heal and rebuild. Rajesh took small steps to restore his confidence and trust in himself, setting new goals and finding purpose in the things that truly mattered to him. Meera, too, found new strength in herself. She realized that her happiness didn't depend on anyone else, not even Rajesh. She had the power to create her own joy, regardless of the challenges life threw at them. The couple started to focus on the things that brought them true fulfillment. They traveled together, spent time with family, and nurtured their passions. Rajesh found a new sense of purpose in his work, pouring his energy into projects that excited him, ones that aligned with his newfound sense of self-worth. And Meera, she began to share her own story, encouraging others to embrace their struggles, to find their own happiness even in the face of hardship. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was real. They learned that happiness wasn't a destination, but a journey. It wasn't something you found in external circumstances, but something that arose from within, from the choices you made, the mindset you embraced, and the love you gave. And that, they realized, was the secret. It was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. To be happy in every situation didn't mean avoiding pain or challenges, but accepting them, embracing them, and choosing to rise above them. It meant being present, being kind to yourself, and learning to let go of the past that no longer served you. A few months later, Meera and Rajesh stood on the balcony of their new home, looking out over the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the world. Meera wrapped her arm around Rajesh's waist, leaning into him, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. "I never thought I'd be here," Rajesh said softly, his voice filled with awe. "I never thought I'd feel this way. It's like I've been given a second chance at life." Meera smiled, squeezing his hand. "It's not a second chance," Rajesh. It's the first real chance you've ever had. To live, to be happy, to be free. He looked down at her, his eyes full of love. And I couldn't ask for a better person to share that chance with. The sun dipped lower, and the world seemed to slow down, as if it too was taking a deep breath, letting go of the tension that had built up over the years. For Meera and Rajesh, this was their moment. The culmination of everything they had worked for, everything they had fought through. The peace they had fought so hard to find was now theirs to keep. As they stood there, side by side, the world around them felt both vast and intimate, the horizon stretching out before them, filled with endless possibilities. They had come a long way, and though there were still challenges to face, they knew one thing for sure. Happiness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created, by making the choice, day after day, to embrace the moment and let go of the past. The story wasn't over. It would never be over. Because happiness, true happiness, was a journey, a continuous process of growth, acceptance, and love. And they would walk that path together, knowing that no matter what came next, they had already found the key to being happy in every situation. And that was enough.